Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for adramofoutlander.com for all things Outlander, from the Dinah Gabaldon book series and the Stars TV series and everything in between. This is episode 78, The Scottish Prisoner, week 10, chapters 19 and 20. Bonjour, bienvenue, j'espère que vous allez bien. Commençons. Quagmire, Chapter 19. The monastery of Inishkara was on the edge of a small lake surrounded by stone buildings. The tower and surrounding wall were crumbled, but there were still many stone buildings and much lively activity. Jamie could hear the bell ringing and the monks scattering to their tasks. There were sheep and a vegetable garden. Jamie was taking in the whole sight of it. He says the men hoeing weeds looked resigned to their Sisyphean task. You remember the guy in the underworld having to push a rock uphill, and he could never get it to the top because it would roll down again? Weeds are Sisyphean, just like dishes and laundry, I'm afraid. Jamie was directed to the largest stone building, and he felt out of place with the immense peace of it. He was irritated with John and Quinn, with the impending confrontation of Siverley, Minnie's warnings of 12 trees, the blasted cup of the Druid King might be there. Then what? Jamie's thoughts were hurtling all around his mind. So we've seen this image now of this peaceful, working place. It's all about life. When he saw Abbot Michael Fitzgibbons, he thought he looked like a leprechaun. He had to smile at this. He was only as high as Jamie's elbow. He was straight-backed with sparkling green eyes and a white beard. Jamie used his Uncle Alex as his bona fides. Bona fides are a person's honesty and sincerity of intention. As in, he went to great lengths to establish his liberal bona fides. It's informal documentary evidence showing a person's legitimacy or credentials. Abbot Michael grins and greets Jamie warmly. Alexander's nephew. Aye, I mind you, boy. I heard a good deal of your adventures years agone, you and your English wife. He grinned in his beard, displaying small, even, white teeth. Do you think Jamie notices his teeth because of Claire and her admonitions to make sure that there is daily cleansing being done in order to keep one's teeth? He inquires about Claire and asks if she is with him. Jamie must have had quite a desperate look upon his face. He explains he lost her in the rising. Abbot Michael offers condolences and whiskey. Jamie accepts the large dram and thought over and over, Lord, that she might be safe, she and the child. The whiskey served to thaw the icy ball in his wame. This was not the time to be grieving. The abbot spoke of unimportant neutral things, the weather, the chapel, the dinner meal to come. Stream of consciousness speaking. We find out that he's colorblind because he cannot state the color of the sauce Brother Bertram makes, and the sacristan would have to tell him what color to wear. A sacristan is an officer charged with the care of the sacristy, the church, and their contents. A sacristy is a room for keeping vestments such as the alb and chasuble and other church furnishings, sacred vessels, and parish records. In some countries, it is known as the vestry. It's usually located inside the church, but in some cases, it's an annex or separate building, as in some monasteries. In most older churches, a sacristy is near a side altar, or more usually behind or on a side of the main altar. And he keeps on talking, all the while watching Jamie's face. When Jamie appears to be back in his regular state of mind, the abbot wordlessly asks him to state his business. Jamie says he values his opinion on a bit of verse. He has a reputation for learning and history, and his uncle said he had a rare collection of tales of the old ones. Michael's wild eyebrows perked up with interest. I like the nod to nature here. His behavior is that of a hummingbird in a flower patch. We will see as we move through this chapter, we see life, nature, and death and darkness. There's contrasts aplenty in this chapter. While the abbot looked over the poem, Jamie's interest in the things in the room took him over, and he stood up to look at the bookshelves. The feel of the space reminded him of Pardlow's library, a place for thinking. You could tell from the books whether a library was meant for show or not. Books that were used had an open, interested feel to them, even if closed and neatly lined up on a shelf in strict order with their fellows. You felt as though the book took as much interest in you as you did in it, and was willing to help you, and was willing to help when you reached for it. Oh, I love that. The abbot's books were well loved and well used. Many lie open on the table with notes sticking out. Jamie so wanted to go see what books were open, what they contained, to run his knuckles over the shelved books until one spoke to him and came willingly in his hand. I think most of us like books to that degree. We want to go hug them and touch them and smell them and hold them and put our hands across the shelf and just listen to which one speaks. I've done that. It's amazing, and I had forgotten that Jamie does that here, his reverence towards learning and towards word. That speaks to my heart. Jamie points out it had been a long time since he owned a book. That's something we can take for granted. Printed books, borrowed books, electronic books, audiobooks, podcasts about books. How many versions of Outlander books do you have, or other books? How many of us have books scattered everywhere? Which books would you grab in case of a fire? The abbot read through the sheets several times, frowning, moving his lips silently. Then suddenly he sat back with a humph. He asked Jamie if he knows who wrote it. Jamie tells him he doesn't. He was given it by an Englishman who didn't write it. He says he translated it poorly, not having the Irish tongue. The abbot cannot make sense of it, tapping his fingers. He's never seen anything like it. He asked Jamie if he's heard of the Wild Hunt tales. Jamie knows of a tale called Tam Lin. A lowlander told it to him while in prison. The abbot says there's nothing from that tale except for maybe the one word, teened. Jamie hadn't noticed it before, but hearing it caused him to bristle, like a dog putting up his hackles. Jamie asks if it means tithe. It does. A tithe to hell. A tithe to hell. Some versions of the tale have it, and some don't. But the notion is that the fairies owe a tithe to hell for their long lives, and that tithe is one of their number, given once every 7 years. The abbot says he thinks a man of that century wrote it, that it isn't old, and he cannot say why. He can't quite put his finger on it. Father Michael needs to get up and move around to think it over more clearly. There's a cute aside about feeling like he needs to get up and dance a jig during long meetings. He points to a beetle pinned to a board, saying he feels like that instead when he cannot move around. Turns out none other than naturalist Lawrence Stern gave it to him. Then he places an object that looks like ivory in Jamie's hand, a giant tooth. It's the tooth of something very large that eats flesh, Father. But I could not tell you, is it a lion or a bear, having not had the advantage of being bitten by either one. Yet, and he made a discreet sign against evil, but as I have not heard that there are lions in Germany, it is from a bear, just as Jamie concludes. Jamie meets Stern not long in the future when he is back in Scotland. This is a sly introduction of Stern because if you skip the Lord John series books, you would never know that Jamie had heard of Stern prior to him telling Claire about it. Jamie realizes Father Michael is using this time to mull things over in his head. Jamie's in no hurry to get back to Quinn and John. He hopes his life will become simpler by one killing the other while he's gone. And right now, he didn't mind which survived. They must be highly irritating him. Father Michael explains the size of the now extinct bear, and Lawrence Stern thought the tooth is thousands of years old. So having Father Michael introduce Lawrence Stern to Jamie in this way lays the foundation for Jamie to be accepting of him when he finally meets him in person himself. Jamie notices a glass box on the shelf. The abbot exclaims Jamie has found the hand. And in this time, we see more description of greenery and nature and the smell of nature as the abbot gets the box down and has Jamie come to the table by the window. Then he opens the box and the stench is overpowering. Is this to say death overtaking life? What is the symbolism here? Jamie could smell peat as he looked at the blackened, curled hand. It had been broken off at the wrist and dried. He smelled the acrid tang of peat bricks that graced every hearth in Ireland. And the abbot turns the hand so Jamie can see the ring that's there. He tells Jamie the story of how it's found in a bog. They determine this man was no peasant. And he goes on to say they found butter in the bog. This perplexes Jamie. The abbot says everyone did it in the summer to keep the butter cool. Now and then it would be forgotten, or maybe the woman who placed it there had died. It was common for them to find butter when they cut peat bricks for the fire. He explains that peat can preserve things. And if you do a web search, there's a huge history of bog butter, and it's fascinating. I will put a link in the post that goes along to the podcast. Some of the butters that have been found were like butter we would have, dairy-based. Some were based on, say, lard. And not only is it thought that peat could preserve things or keep it cool, it could also flavor the different butters that one might place there and maybe giving it an elevated taste. From what I read, there's a whole bunch of different ideas, but people indeed did put things in the bog, especially quote-unquote butter. After they had found the hand, they went back and prodded around and found the rest of him. And at this, Jamie felt someone standing right behind him. He was lying on his back as though he'd been laid out dead, and he'd had on rough breeks and a cloak with a small gold brooch to fasten it at the throat. Speaking of throats, someone had cut his for him, and had bashed his head for good measure. The abbot smiled, though without his usual humor, and to make quite sure of the thing, there was a thin rope wrapped tight around his neck. Jamie was absolutely disquieted and uncomfortable with the sense of someone behind him. So much he had to glance over his shoulder. Of course, no one was there. Father Michael asked Jamie if he knows a couple of Irish poems. He thinks he knows what one word means, death, because he's pretty sure he heard Quinn muttering it in regard to Lord John. Again, there's lots of interplay in this chapter between life and death. Father Michael goes on to explain both poems speak of a threefold death, and that type of death is usually reserved for gods or heroes. But in the case of those two poems, it was imposed for crimes committed against the church. Jamie moved away from the table, leaning against the wall. He still felt a small prickle, but much better overall. He wants to know if the gentleman did something of the sort. The father says he doesn't think so, but doesn't know. Father Michael tells of the digging and the 3 months' worth of peats they ended up with. They also found a gold hilt near the body and a cup with inlaid jewels and some other pieces he gestured to. Jamie asks what they are, and it looks like parts of an instrument. He says an old woman told him they're called a lyre, but she had no idea how she knew that. And the monks had decided there was more ceremony than murder about this man's death. So what Father Michael, the abbot, has to say next piqued my interest. There are several parts of this that I decided to look up what he was talking about. Word got about, of course, and the folk of the country thought he might be everything from the High King of the Druids, assuming there ever to have been such a creature, to Fionn McCool, though why he should be lying in a bog and not having it away with the female denizens of Tir na Nog, I don't know. To Saint Hugulfus. Now, in that one little passage, I had to look up pronunciations for several different things and definitions. So, Fionn McCool was a mythical Irish warrior. Tir na Nog is depicted as a supernatural realm of everlasting youth, beauty, health, abundance, and joy. Its inhabitants are the Tuatha De Danann, the gods of pre-Christian Ireland. There's a lot of information on it on the web. I found it fascinating. It took me so much more time to write up my notes because this chapter has so many points of rabbit hole interest in it. And yes, I've read this book a few times before, but I was reading it for the overall story, and I never stopped to look at these details, and it's so rich. And I hope you pick up some new things as we're going through it, just like I have. Jamie asks if there is a Saint Hugulfus. The abbot says no, but the locals won't believe it, and they were going to build a special chapel and wanted to put his body under glass with beeswax candles burning at his head and feet. But to stop this from happening, they put the body back in the ground, took the jewels off, and made it known they were sent to Dublin. He sent the brooch and sword hilt so no one would try and dig him up for them. He asked Jamie if he'd like to see the cup. Jamie's heart thumps. Keys in hand, the father has Jamie follow him. Outside it was beautiful and fresh, but Jamie couldn't shake the feeling when he saw the hand. Father, why did you keep his hand? The ring has runes on it, he explains. There was no way to take it off without the finger crumbling to pieces. He means to draw the ring in symbols and send it to someone who understands the ancient Irish alphabet, Ogham. He always meant to bury the hand with the body and still does. And they stop at a root cellar. And Jamie wonders why anybody would have to lock up a root cellar. Jamie realized, with the famine Quinn had spoken of still green in the memory of Ireland, food might be the most valuable thing the monastery had. The cup was hidden behind old apples. They were shriveled. But it did look valuable to Jamie. It was the size of a small quaich, which is a Scottish drinking cup of the 17th and 18th centuries, having a shallow bowl with 2 or 3 flat handles. It was stained and darkened by immersion in the peat, but still beautifully made. There was a carving in the bottom of the bowl, and gemstones, uncut but polished, were set round the rim, each one sunk into a small carved depression and apparently fastened there with some sort of resin. He had a sense that someone was standing behind him again. Father Michael asked him what it is, my son. Does it speak to Jamie? It does, and he thinks it is saying to put me back. Jamie isn't sure if it's evil, but it gives him an odd grue, a shivering. I happen to call the grue getting the willies. Then Jamie notices a carving on the bottom. It's a cleft standing stone, and Jamie shivers down his legs. At this, Jamie asks the father to hear his confession. They go out and cross a sheep field and go into the orchard, finding some stones to sit upon. They are back to nature and life once again. In the simplest way, he told him about Quinn, the fresh Jacobite rising in Ireland that's brewing, and the idea of using the Druid King's cup to make it legit. The abbot just listened all the while Jamie talked. When he was done, Father Michael looked up at him. He asked Jamie if he came to steal the cup for the purpose he had himself. No. The abbot agrees no, of course not, because Jamie said to put it back. It's no my place to say, Father, but The presence that had hovered near him earlier had vanished, but the memory of it was cold in his mind. He wants it back, Father. The man you found in the bog. The abbot's green eyes went wide, and he studied Jamie closely. He spoke to you, did he? Not in words, no. I felt him. He's gone now. The abbot considers the cup and asks him to go on because he knows there's more. Jamie knew John's business wasn't his to share, but the priest knew there was more on his mind. Father Michael reassures Jamie the confession is under the seal. He tells Jamie to tell God and let him ease you, man, and takes his hands, placing them on his bony knees. Jamie starts slowly but tells him what the Greys want of him and how they made him come to Ireland, being caught between loyalty to Quinn and forced obligation to Grey. Do you think this in any way speaks to how Jamie views the relationship in equality with Grey? Next he tells of John's feelings for him and what passed between them in the stable at Hellwater, and finally about Willie and Geneva. When he got to that point, he likens it to the feeling of jumping off a high cliff into roaring seas. Chaos. Jamie had tears running down his face and was crying before he could finish it. The abbot handed him a clean black handkerchief to wipe his face. He tells Jamie to sit and rest while he thinks on it all. Jamie felt emptied, purged. He poured it all out into that roiling sea in his mind. And he found a place of peace more than he'd had since the days before Culloden. 14 years is a long time not to have peace. His mind was blank. He breathed freely. That was enough. All those burdens. Before Claire left, he would talk to her. He had no one to share these deep things with. And it's rare to be in the presence of a priest, especially with the anti-papist attitudes of the time. He learned to pour himself out into Claire, and she would listen. He kept very little back from her. There was more, though. The spring sun came out from behind the clouds and warmed him. A bee lightly, briefly on his sleeve, spilling grains of yellow pollen when it rose, and the bruised grass where he knelt smelled of rest and comfort. He's reintegrating. He's something new. It's lovely. It's a great picture. And the bruised grass that he left was that part of him that he left there. He sat in exhausted mindlessness for an indeterminate amount of time. Then the father rustled. Well now, let's begin with the easy bits. You're not in the habit of fornicating regularly with young women, I hope. Good. Don't start. He says he was going to recommend Jamie find a good girl and marry her, but he can see his wife is still with him. But then the interesting part. comes up. It wouldn't be fair in a young woman were you to marry while that's the case. At the same time, you mustn't cling over long to the memory of your wife. She's safe with God now, and you must deal with your life. Soon. But you'll know when it's right. Meanwhile, avoid the occasion of sin, aye? To me, this reeks of foreshadowing to Leary and Jenny's meddling. And standing in between them at the altar was the visage of Claire. Jenny saw it, but she didn't stop the wedding. And when we get to that point, Jamie just didn't want to feel alone anymore. He wanted to feel part of something and someone. So he tried to do what the Father said. And I wonder, even though he never says it later in the Outlander books, if Father Michael saying this to him impacted his decision to marry Leary. But sadly, Claire was still between them. And way later, in a book, Jamie does something that infuriates me. And I think reading this again, I understand why. Sometimes he apologizes for things that others might not perceive as wrongdoing. Jamie's not thinking far ahead. He's not thinking of anything except Hellwater. And he says yes and thinks of how he avoided Betty thus far. The Father advises cold baths and reading. Then he hits Jamie in the face with the next words, telling him not to endanger the boy. He has no claim on him. William is settled. He asks if it might be better for Jamie to leave the place where he is. Jamie begins to speak, but the abbot interrupts. He knows he's a paroled prisoner, but if things go well with his task here, he might earn his freedom to leave. Jamie doesn't think he could leave William, not now. And he says, Father, I hear what you say, but the boy has no father, no man to show him the way of being a man. His grandfather's a worthy gentleman, but very old. And the man who was legally his father is dead. If I thought for an instant that my presence there was a danger to him rather than benefit, I would go at once. But I do not think I delude myself in thinking that he needs me. Father Michael advises him to pray for the strength to do the right thing, that God will give it to him. Jamie remembers praying for that twice before, and it had been granted. He hoped if he prayed for it for a third time, he wouldn't. I thought you said this was the easy bits. And the Father meant easy to see what's to do, not in doing. They walked the orchard into the fields. They kept to the edges and eventually emerged on the edge of a bog. And here's how Jamie describes it. This was a proper bog, not merely the soggy clay or spongy footing common everywhere in Ireland. A treeless, gray-green, bumpy landscape, it stretched a good half-mile before them to a tiny hillock of rock in the far distance, from which a stunted pine tree sprouted, flag-like in the wind. For once out of the shelter of the trees, the wind had come up and sang about their ears, flapping the ends of Father Michael's stola and tugging at the skirts of their clothing. They came along a trackway, and Father Michael has no idea who made the tracks, but they keep them up to safely cross the moss. As Jamie steps on it, the vibration underfoot feels like antennae of the moss quivering. Some of how he is communing with nature here reminds me so much of Claire. How many facets of them are alike in their need to be earthbound and part of nature, and life is what they are about. Fulfilling it, pursuing it, protecting it. That's what they do. Father Michael talks of the old ones and how they also believed in the number 3 being holy. 3 gods, thunder, Tyrannus. The underworld, Asus. The third is a god of the particular tribe. Jamie wonders why he's telling him this. To only pass time? And they were crossing a bog. He explains to Jamie the old gods required blood sacrifices. And we get the feeling of the wind and the sounds of nature surrounding them. The old ones would take prisoners of war and burn them in great wicker baskets for Tyrannus. A good thing for you, the English are more civilized now. The abbot was obviously giving his impression of English civility. And Jamie thinks the English had burned things, crofts, fields, whether or not women and children were in there and burned or left to starve. They talk of the English hanging men still, and that was Asa's preferred method of death. Well, the hanging does not always answer. Sometimes a man will live in spite of it, which is why whoever did in your Bog Man wrapped the rope around his neck instead. Though I should have thought the bashing and throat-cutting and drowning, assuming he had any breath left to drown with, would have made it certain enough in any case. Being hanged and not dying. Remember this tidbit for when you get to the Fiery Cross book. I don't know how Diana does it. There's threads that are easily ignored. There's little pieces, like half a sentence. And then it shows up books later. Aha! That's one of the reasons I see value in doing these podcasts and read-alongs, because they're intricate. It is not surface material. Then the abbot suddenly remembers the name of one of the third tribal gods, Tutates, and drowning was his method. They came to a hole in the bog. Jamie thinks this is where they cut peat bricks and likely found the body. Jamie is trying to figure out why they're going to the gravesite. What does it have to do with his confession? And he realizes he hasn't been absolved of his sins yet. The father goes on to explain they couldn't put the bog man back in the peats or someone would dig him up again. So you put him under the hill. And Jamie had a chill remembering the poem. The king from under the hill. The old ones were from under the hill, the fairy folk. He followed the father, waiting behind him. He was worried he might get stuck, and there was no way Father Michael could free Jamie if he did. But his feet only sunk to ankle deep, and he found himself on the little hillock with only a few splashes to his breeks. Now they were at the difficult part. He took Jamie to the top of the hillock. There was a crude seat carved out of native stone. It is the high seat where the kings of old were confirmed before their old gods. They both crossed themselves. This place did feel old, quiet, without wind. Father Michael took out the cup and placed it on the ancient seat. He tells Jamie he knows what he was before the rising in Scotland, his uncle Alex had told him. Jamie says it was a long time ago, and his neck prickled. You're in the prime of your manhood, Seamus McBrien. Is it right that you should waste the strength and the gift you have for leading men? Jesus God, he wants me to do it, Jamie thought, appalled. Take that cursed thing and do as Quinn wants. Is it right for me to lead men to their deaths for the sake of a vain cause? Vain? The cause of the Church of God? To restore the anointed king and remove the foot of the English from the neck of your people and mine? Jamie is pretty aghast about this. He shoots back at Father Michael, telling him he doesn't know what happened after the rising. He hasn't seen the devastation. He told them the clans were crushed. And then he gathers himself before speaking further. He tells of his hiding in a cave for 7 years out of fear of the English. He tells of coming down to hunt and crossing a croft for the umpteenth time and stepping on the bones of a wee lass. He wasn't sure which of the girls who had lived there it was. It could have been one of 3. Father Michael interrupts Jamie, saying he's seen those things in Ireland. And Jamie responds bitterly. His fists curl on their own. And he asks the father if he wants to see that sort of thing again. Will they stop? Will you condemn your countrymen and mine to such cruelties, to the rule of the Yellow Johns for lack of will? I'd not thought from Alexander's letters that you lacked courage, but perhaps he was wrong in what he thought of you. Oh, no, father. Dinna be trying that one on me, I ken what it's like to lead men and how it's done. I'll not be led. He is trying to guilt Jamie, who has lost everything for a cause he didn't want to be part of, but had to be. Then the father claims it's Jamie's duty he would be turning away from, and he brings out some fighting words. Jamie goes on to tell him in no uncertain terms what he has lost for duty, and that it will not be different if it comes to war. The priest will not give up. He talks of sins of commission and omission, and if Jamie will not use the talents God has bestowed upon him... Jamie has figured out at this point that Father Michael knows way more about the Jacobites and what is afoot. And Jamie also understands the priest was doing his duty as he saw it, but... Then he changes the subject quite suddenly, asking if there's a cleft stone nearby. This flustered the father by the switch of topics, but he answers yes, there's a circle of stones with a large cleft stone about a mile away. Now Jamie has to decide if he should tell exactly how he knows the Stuarts would again be quashed. He thinks not to tell him about Claire's traveling and where he got the knowledge, and the father might think he'd completely lost his marbles too, come to that. He asked the priest why he brought the cup with them here. The priest had brought it to give to Jamie if he was the right man for it. If not, he'll give it back to the original owner. I am not, father. I cannot touch the thing. Perhaps it's a sign that I am not the man. Father Michael asks if Jamie now feels the presence of the Bog Man. He does. Unsettling in the feeling of eagerness or desperation behind him. And Jamie wonders if the dead man could be a traveler like Claire, if that's the meaning of the carving on the cup. Is he trapped here, far from where he came from? I always find Jamie so practical in thought. I think he has a great brain for puzzles, and these pieces stay out there and they start falling into place to form a picture that he can see and assess. Then, momentarily, he panics in doubt for Claire. What if she didn't make it through the stones safely and is trapped? Horror grips him. His fists cut into his flesh with his nails, and he clings to the realness of this pain so he can dismiss the thought as something unsubstantial and not real. He again prays, and this time in agony, Lord, that she might be safe, she and the child. And Jamie whispers for the father to absolve him so he can leave this place. When Father Michael doesn't respond immediately, Jamie lashes out at him. Do you think to blackmail me by withholding absolution, you blackguard priest? You would betray your vows and your office for the sake of... An upraised hand stopped Jamie's speech. Father Michael glares at him, then traces the sign of the cross in the air. Ego te absolve, in nomine Patris. Jamie apologizes. The priest takes that outburst as part of the confession. He tells him to say the rosary every day for a month for his penance. Et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. He wants to know if Jamie remembers how the act of contrition goes. And he has a bit of leprechaun lurking behind his green eyes. Mon Dieu, je regrette. Jamie always says it in French. And I looked up a current act of contrition in French, and it goes, Mon Dieu, j'ai un très grand regret de te voir offensé parce que tu es infiniment bon et infiniment aimable et que le péché te déplaît. C'est pourquoi je prends la ferme résolution, avec le secours de ta sainte grâce, de ne plus t'offenser et de faire pénitence. That is why I started the podcast en français. There's so many different languages in this chapter that I thought it would be something different. As Jamie finished speaking, the air was still around him. Now he sees something he hadn't noticed before, a mound of slightly darker rock and soil, fresh grass sprouting, wildflowers, and a cross under the pine tree. This is where the stranger's grave was. He was anonymously buried near the seat of kings. The day was turning into evening as the light came low, casting long shadows. The darkness returns. Father Michael asks Jamie to wait a moment as he retrieves the cup, and he wants to see it safe. Jamie pauses and ponders the bog and thinks of who or what else might be buried there. It brings him back to Scotland, reminded of a moss hag, which is, chiefly Scottish, a pit or slough in a marshy place, especially a place where peat has been cut. And he tells the father he can find his own way. I can't tell you how many times I stopped and had to look things up, searched for definitions, wanted to know how something was pronounced. This chapter is chock full of life, death, burden, relief, plots, duty, the supernatural, being bound to the earth. Jamie carrying the burden of knowing what is to come, given by Claire. He has knowledge no one else does. History cannot be changed. He's tried before. Now, after giving confession, Jamie can move forward with a clearer mind and conscience. His foundation of faith that he brings to the books is something that draws me near. I find it a beautiful testimony on Diana's behalf. I know that they are practicing Roman Catholics. And she presents it in a way that makes one's interest piqued. I think for me, it has widened my understanding and giving me cause to search. And though I'm a Protestant, I appreciate the ritual and the prayers for everything and the saints and the interactions. And it has given me something wonderful in addition to my Protestant beliefs. Chapter 20, Stalking Horse. That is a false pretext concealing someone's real intentions. When Jamie returned, Quinn was off doing his own business, but he surely would be back soon. He told John about what the abbot said regarding the poem, and they decided Jamie would reach out to Siverley first. John wants Jamie to show him the poem and if Syverly doesn't recognize it, then it was a mistake by Carruthers. But if he does, John wants to know what he has to say about it. John was clearly excited. Things were moving forward. And once you've spied out the land for me, I'll have a better notion of which tack to take when I see him. And of course, Jamie realizes he is the stalking horse. There was much discussion on what Jamie should wear, and he followed Tom Bird's advice. John and Tom had argued over the outfit. Jamie thinks it's wise for Syverly to feel superior to him, and dressing more commonly might be a good idea. Jamie was unsure if Syverly would recognize him from his Paris days. He'd seen him here and there over a course of weeks. And since Jamie could remember him from a few sightings, he might remember Jamie as well. And they may have even spoken once. He doesn't remember. Jamie had worked with his cousin Jared in the wine business, and it is conceivable Jamie could have continued that line of work. There's no reason Syverly would know what came of him after the rising. And Jamie hadn't commented to John or Tom that his manner of English speech would also lower him to Syverly. He broadened his accent when he gave his horse to the gatekeeper when he arrived at Syverly's estate. Jamie interacts with the gatekeeper and asking him if the master is at home. The gatekeeper says he'll see if Syverly is taking visitors. Jamie thanks him, handing him a tip and a note from Melchior for an interview. His role as a rich vulgarian thus promisingly begun. Jamie continues this ruse by gaping at the house and grounds as he walked after the servant. He takes in the house, old and well kept. It has 14 chimneys. Remember in Voyager when Ian was taken from Seal Island? And Jamie could detail all the dimensions of the ship, how many masts, the size of it, the color of it, and Claire just remembered the color and basic shape. Well, he's doing that here as well. He notices a horse in the pasture, a dark bay that he approves of, and there was a large lawn. This was an impressive estate. Jamie fully expected to be seen by Syverly, and when he reached the door, his cloak and hat were taken by the butler. Into the drawing room, he sees it's nicely appointed, and there's lots of detail. There were all sorts of eclectic pieces about the room. He takes notice of a vicious-looking club and a rectangular strap decorated and woven. He thinks it looks like a magpie collection. No woman would have collected and assembled these things together. And for all the conversations with John and all the detail from Carruthers' papers, Syverly's personality was an unknown to Jamie. And here's what he thinks. A man may smile and a smile and be a villain. He had himself met personable villains and amiable fools whose actions did more damage than deliberately wicked men. His mouth set at the memory of Charles Edward Stuart. He had no doubt that Syverly was a villain, but what kind of villain was the question. In comes Major Syverly with a heavy limp. He's tall like Jamie, but older and becoming paunchy. He had an expression of welcome, but there was a hardness and open cruelty to his face. Jamie cordially greets him, all the while thinking any soldier unlucky enough to draw Syverly as a commander would know immediately what he was in for. Syverly greeted him back and pointedly looked him over. He immediately gets down to business, not offering refreshment or even a seat. And Jamie thinks he doesn't merit very highly to take up much of Syverly's time. Jamie tells him he's heard of his expertise in matters of antiquity while waving to a 50-year-old object. This quirks Syverly's interest as he hands Syverly the paper. Jamie sits down on the settee, and as Syverly reads the paper, he stiffens. and looks at Jamie piercingly for a minute. Then he looks back at the paper and reads it twice, and then places it on the mantelpiece. Notice he didn't give it back to Jamie. And he goes over and stands in front of Jamie menacingly and asks him who the bloody hell he is. "Who do you think I am?" Syverly narrowly stares at Jamie for a long time. And he asks who gave Jamie the paper. "A friend," he replies. "His name is not mine to share." This hits Syverly hard, and he sits across from Jamie, never taking his eyes from him. Is it suspicion or recognition in his gaze? Jamie's heart is beating quickly. "No," Syverly said at last, and his voice had changed. It was casual now, dismissive. "I have no idea how your friend came by that paper, but it doesn't matter. The subject of the poem is ancient, to be sure, but the verse itself is no more ancient than you yourself are, Mr. Fraser. Anyone who's read Irish verse in a scholarly way could tell you that." He smiled, an expression that didn't reach his deep-set eyes, the color of rainwater on slate. "What is your interest in such a thing, Mr. Fraser?" "If you are in the way to collect antiquities and curios, I should be pleased to give you an introduction to one or two dealers in Dublin." Jamie tells him he knows a man at the university in Dublin who might be interested. This alarms Syverly. Jamie thinks he doesn't want others to see it in case the wrong person should hear of it. Syverly asks for the name of the university man, and Jamie makes one up on the spot. And no, Syverly doesn't know this O'Hanlon either. And Jamie thanks him for his time and prepares to leave. What did Jamie learn here? That the poem is somehow connected to Syverly. It has a secret meaning. And he caused Syverly to look at him as a person of interest. Syverly asks Jamie where he is staying in case he has more information for him, and he tells him at Beckett's public house. Jamie rises and bows to Syverly, then goes toward the mantelpiece to retrieve the paper. And Syverly stands behind him. And Jamie can feel danger in this movement, and his reflexes save him as the club splinters the mantelpiece with a blow. Syverly is trying to kill him. Jamie reacts. He lowers himself and butts Syverly with his head, causing Syverly to stumble and knock the table askew. Jamie makes for the door, then goes back to grab the paper. He had to shove Syverly, who lunged for him. He swung the club at Jamie again, catching him at the shoulder. Jamie flung the candlesticks at him. Then he leaps out the window, catching a final blow across the arse as he went. He ran, hobbled through the garden, wondering where his horse was. He found it, and is thankful he was struck on the right side so he could still ride. He was on his way back to the village in no time. His left buttock was bruised and knotted, and he's glad there's no pursuit, and then thinks, why would there be? Syverly knows where to find him, so there would be no need. And it was raining, heavily. He'd left his cloak and hat. Tom Bird would surely be annoyed, and he smiled at that thought. He'd done his part. It was now John's turn. Holy hell! We know Jamie is difficult to kill, but come on. That is something he didn't expect at all. Thankfully, he has really excellent instincts, and he knew something was amiss as soon as Syverly stood behind him. But Jamie's keen way of looking at a space and taking it all in also helped his instincts respond without him even knowing why immediately. See, Claire goes into a space and she likes to see everything, to see what's going on so she can be part of it and integrate it. I think for Jamie, it's more for tactical purposes. We have gotten into the thick of it now. The story is moving quickly and deeply. What did you think of how much detail was in the chapter with the priest Quagmire? There's more to be unpacked from that chapter that's coming that we couldn't really talk about today. I thought it was fascinating, and I liked that the abbot, who's related to Murtaugh, knows his uncle from France in the abbey. So where can you find A Dram of Outlander? Well, the website is adramofoutlander.com, and the podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Facebook is A Dram of Outlander page. There's also a private group just for podcast listeners, and it's A Dram of Outlander group, and you have to ask to join. Instagram and Twitter are Dram of Outlander. And why is Twitter important? Because every Wednesday night there is a hashtag ADOO Twitter chat, and we talk about the prior weekend's podcast. So next Wednesday, we will be discussing these two chapters. And it's really incredible to get insights from readers and listeners, and we delve into the material even deeper. And sometimes we get off on tangents, and it's really fun. And y'all are super smart. So how do you participate and support A Dram of Outlander? Well, joining in on Wednesday nights, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, talking to each other on the social media pages, leaving comments to me on the website posts, leaving iTunes reviews is really, really important. It'll take you a couple of minutes if that's how you listen, and it helps people find me because it boosts position. You can support A Dram of Outlander by sharing the posts, having people listen, pointing people this way. You can financially support the podcast through patreon.com/A Dram of Outlander to do a monthly offering, or if you want to do a one-time offering, which a few people have, thank you. You can contact me privately through email, and I will give you detail on that. And please, you can also interact and participate by leaving a voicemail on the listener line, 719-425-9444, and your comments could be included in a future podcast. And I would really like some listeners to be a guest on a future podcast. Please email me at adramofoutlander@gmail.com or call the listener line. And you could come on and talk about the chapters with me that we're covering, or just sit and chat for a few minutes about whatever in Outlander that you want to talk about. Next podcast, we'll cover chapters 21 and 22. And we know since Major Syverly is trying to kill Jamie over this poem, there's way more crazy coming our way. And we still haven't gotten to the bottom of 12 Trees. And John hasn't even gotten involved with Syverly yet. It's going to be an excellent ride. So I hope you have a fantastic week. Thank you for listening and joining in. And until next time, slán je va.